Hello and welcome to Lab 7, Climate Patterns. This video is being provided for you so you can see and have the instructions by page, step by step, where I'll provide some hints, tips, and some tricks to work through this lab efficiently and effectively. This is also going to be helpful, especially as you are working through your course, whether it be face-to-face or online, so you can reference back and see an explanation on how some of the math and concepts are completed. I find them very helpful when you're reviewing for exams, because perhaps you forgot how to do a certain part or you weren't sure what that meant. You're able to come back to these and check out the chapters that have been separated within this lab to see it. Now we can see the learning objectives for this lab are to learn how to interpret climate graphs, to explain the main controls of climate, compare climates by using the Köppen-Geiger classification system, to apply an understanding of climate types in California and your local area, and to analyze temporal and spatial climate shifts. That being said, let's start Lab 7. So climate is obviously a catch term that's being very popularized right now. I think what's important to understand about climate is that climate is a lot different than just weather. Weather is day to day, hot, cold, wet, dry. Climate, on the other hand, is long-term data. We're looking at about 30 years worth of day-to-day weather data to understand an overall climate. A climate is like a generalization using all of that data. So when we say that climate is changing, we're not saying that one day is different than the next. We're saying that we have seen patterns over decades of change. And that's a really, really important piece to understand here. So that being said, we can see that Part A is entitled Controls on Climate. It says, why is New York hot and humid in the summer? Why is Seattle known for its rain? Why does San Diego experience so many days of sunshine? To answer these questions, you must understand the major variables that influence a location's climate, the long-term weather conditions. What you've learned so far in this physical geography laboratory course will help you understand some of these attributes. So the first thing that we can do is we can learn to interpret a climograph. A climograph is essentially a climate graph of long-term data. So if I move on to this next page here, we can see that it says pin it. Here is a blank climate graph. So the scientific community uses the metric system, so climate graphs and climate classification data in this lab are going to be shown using the metric system. To just kind of put in perspective, 50 degrees Fahrenheit is about 10 degrees Celsius. To just kind of put those values in order. So Fahrenheit is what we're obviously most accustomed to in the US, but in the scientific community, we use Celsius, centimeters, meters, and so on and so forth. So what is important to observe about this graph, figure 9.1, is that we can see on the bottom it has letters. Each letter, or each column that might be, represents a month. And then on the left-hand side, each line is representing a measurement of precipitation in centimeters, and then on the right would be temperature in Celsius. So what you would have is, using this graph, you could have two different elements on this graph. Mostly, it's done using a bar graph for precipitation, and that's usually in a blue, and then we usually use a red line or a different color line to represent temperature that's been plotted, and we can then observe that information. So in order to complete a climate graph, we need to have the average monthly precipitation and temperature rates for a specific location. So it says here on the next page that we have that. So here we have the average precipitation in centimeters and temperature in Celsius. Now this data, again, is not just from last January or this January, we're talking at least 30 solid years of January data has been put into a spreadsheet and averaged, so we can look at the high and the low to get an average number. So it says here in its example, we'll first plot the precipitation data from table 9.1, which is this table here, and put it on a climate graph using a bar graph for each month to represent the precipitation. So as you will note in figure 9.2 below, the blue bars are representing that average monthly precipitation. Note, the blue color is arbitrary. It's just whatever you want to use, but I traditionally have always used blue. So then moving forward, we're now able to add the next piece, which is the average temperature. So we're now able to observe a climograph showing the average annual precipitation and average annual temperature by month. So question 1 says, refer to the completed climate graph 9.3, and how does this climate graph help you understand the location's climate? Create a list of what you can determine based on your observations. What can you interpret about this location based on these values? To kind of put things into perspective, just as a reminder, when we're talking about precipitation, about 2.54 centimeters is equivalent to 1 inch. So when we're looking at just averages, if you want to put it in that perspective for your mindset, that might help you put it into a better frame of mind. Now, once you complete that, we can also look at the 5 major controls on climate. So now that you're familiar with how to observe and interpret climate graphs, we can now look at some of the variables that influence a location's climate. We call these climate controls. So on the next page, we can see what they are. The first one is going to be latitude. So the first and most important variable that influences a location's climate is its latitude. Low latitudes, or ones that are closer along the equator, receive higher total insolation year-round, or incoming solar radiation, versus higher latitude closer to the poles. So locations at tropical latitudes show very little temperature change throughout the course of the year, while on the other hand, locations of higher latitude would experience a greater fluctuation. So question 2 says, compare the 2 climate graphs below. Does climate graph A or B represent a location such as 61 degrees north latitude? Explain your response with at least 1 sentence. So based on the information provided above this lab about how latitude can contribute and affect climate, which one do you think would best represent that location? Now, continentality. So the second variable that influences a location's climate is its continentality. That refers to whether a location is located along a coastline or is completely inland or landlocked. Variations in climate are due in part of land-water contrasts. So as you continue working through this, question 3 takes you to, again, climate graph C and D. It says compare the 2 climate graphs shown. Both locations are near 40 degrees north latitude. Which one, letter C or D, would represent a maritime location, and explain why? So then moving forward, another great effect on this would be wind patterns and air masses. So wind patterns and air masses also influence a location's climate. Here are several examples of their influence, such as in mid-latitudes in the northern hemisphere, the dominant winds are the westerlies. These winds travel from west to east and bring seasonal warmth or coolness to eastern locations. And you'll see that there's some additional references there. Moving forward, question 4, comparing climate graphs E and F. They are both located and found at 21 degrees north latitude. Why does one location depict, by climate graph E, have higher levels of precipitation when compared to climate graph F? So again, using information that you have observed and interpreted so far in this lab, make those correlations. Why is climate graph E have exceedingly amount of precipitation versus climate graph F, although they're at the same latitude? So moving forward, we can see that ocean currents are also a contributing piece to this. Ocean currents influence a location's climate. The major surface ocean currents move warm water from equatorial regions towards the polar regions, and they bring cold water from the polar regions back to the equatorial regions. So as a result of this circulation, it provides a significant mechanism of global heat transfer. So here we have a beautiful diagram, figure 9.7, the map of the surface ocean currents. So we can see, if you just want to just very simplistically look at this diagram, you can see the blue and red. Blue is colder water, red is warmer water. Warmer equatorial, blue versus polar. Look at the mixing and how that occurs. That mixing is really working towards equilibrium. It's so important that this occurs. So question 5 says, okay, let's look at a climate graph. Both locations are at 33 degrees latitude. Based on the temperature curves of both the graphs, how do you know if these locations are either in the northern or the southern hemisphere? So using this information and looking at these climate graphs, which one do you think would be in the northern versus the southern hemisphere? Something that's very helpful when understanding that is, think about this. A majority, nearly 70% of all the landmass of our planet is found within one particular hemisphere. That might be helpful for you when trying to solve that question. And then question 6 says, comparing the two graphs below, which location has a warm surface current, and explain why. Another contributing factor to how climate really is distributed across our planet will be the elevation, right? That altitude. So it says the final important control on climate is its elevation. As you learned when you studied orographic lifting, under normal conditions, temperatures decrease with altitude. So that being said, question 7 says, comparing the next two climate graphs shown, figure 9.9, both are found at 48 degrees north latitude, but which location would represent a location in the rain shadow of a mountain? Remember, so when you learned about orographic lift, one side will have a majority of that precipitation because as the cloud gets lifted up, it gets cooler, there's less pressure, the condensation occurs, and precipitation can occur, and then that cloud goes over the mountain, sinks back down, and it gets warmer due to atmospheric pressure. It's heat by compression. So that being said, one side is usually wetter and the other side is drier. So looking at these next climate graphs, are we able to make some form of observation which side would be of which? So now we plug into a pennant the 5 main controls of temperature. Remember, the 5 main controls of temperature when analyzing a location's climate will be its latitude, continentality, wind pattern, air mass, ocean currents, and its elevation. So question 8 kind of brings everything together. It says, now apply what you've learned. Match climate graphs B through J to their real-world locations shown on table 9.2. Now to complete the table, use a globe or atlas or the internet to find where each city is located. Is the city's, what its elevation is, whether the city is maritime, continental, so on and so forth. It does provide some additional tips. So again, that's going to be climate graphs B as in boy, through J. And then you have them here. So these are our random locations. You're going to match those up, and then once you've matched them up, you're going to be able to include the latitude to the nearest degree, the elevation for that location, is it maritime or continental, the climate graph letters section from B through J, and the list of the major climate controls in that city. Based on those 5 climate controls, write down the major climate controls of that city. Now, the climate graph letter, it says selected from B to J, is a little bit different. When you're looking at these climate graph, you're going to see the letter. So you pick the letter that goes there. So that way we know, okay, so if we decide that Anchorage, Alaska is letter B, you'd write letter B there. And the key is I would do it in pencil first. So that way, in case you make mistakes, you can move it around. But I think what would be of most help first is to really just sit there and find out what is the general latitude, north or south, for each of these locations. And when you're doing that, try to find out what its average elevation or altitude is, so you kind of have an idea there. Then you're going to be able to match them, and I think it's going to make it so much easier for yourself. But anyway, that being said, that wraps up Part A. So Part B is called Climate Classification. Now, being able to do this is really helpful. I think it really allows you to generalize and to understand regions, but many geographers and earth scientists will argue that this is not always the best way to do it because of certain examples. Small places, small states, not a problem. It's usually the same weather and climate on both sides of those areas, and there's not a lot of variation. But places like California, as an example, the weather can be very, very different. The general climate is very, very different compared to San Diego versus San Francisco. So that it becomes challenging if you want to be able to give California just one climate classification. It's impossible. We have to do it in regions. But other states can be done. An entire state can be classified. But what this does is it takes all that data and creates a generalization. So I always give this example in my class. Imagine that I'm going to pay an all-expense-paid trip to Las Vegas in July, but you have to pack now. Whatever month it is, doesn't matter what it is, you have to pack this early on. Could you do it? And the answer is, of course you could. It's going to be Las Vegas in July. It's going to be hot. I mean, could it rain? It's possible. They do get freak summer storms out in Las Vegas, but we know it's generally going to be bathing suit weather because we're able to take long-term understanding and data of that region and to create that classification. So that's really how this works. So the way that this works, which is again one of the most popular methods that is done, and we've been using it forever, is that we first start off into like tiers. We start with the basic climate group, and then we can break it up into temperature and stuff like that. So it says here, to understand, to begin, that these are our general climate areas. We've got tropical, dry, temperate, continental, and polar. Now each one of those regions has been denoted a letter. So tropical climates will begin with a letter A, a capital A. Temperate climates will be given a capital C, and so on and so forth. Now, using your critical thinking skills, why do you think average monthly temperatures were used to classify climates? So based on what you've observed about these different region areas and types of climates, why do you think that the average monthly temperatures are so important when coming to this idea? Question 10 says, using again your critical thinking skills, why do you think particular temperatures were used to classify these climates? In other words, why would the creators of the Köppen-Geiger climate classification system say that, use 0 degrees Celsius, 10 degrees Celsius, 18 degrees Celsius to divide the climate types? So what are those breaking points? What does 32 degrees Fahrenheit really mean? What does 50 degrees Fahrenheit mean? And so on and so forth. There is a reason why those numbers were chosen, and kind of think about it. I mean, I don't know, when I think about stuff like this, I put it in perspective. You have probably experienced 32 degrees Fahrenheit. You've probably experienced 50 degrees or 64. What does that mean for you? Now, moving forward, the map below, figure 9.10, is a very generalized climate map showing the average climates between 1901 and 2010. So we can see this is broken up as just tropical, dry, temperate, continental, and polar. Very simplistic. We'll dive a little more into, essentially you segregate each one. You subdivide tropical areas a little bit smaller, but for now, big picture. So figure 9.10, this is question 11. List 3 primary observations that you make based on the spatial patterns presented in this map. These observations can be something that is either, unexpected, surprised, or maybe even you expected something like that. So, is there correlations? Are there any patterns that you observe in this map? So then it says, within each of the 5 main climate types, there are further subdivision climates. Figure 9.11 is a map that shows all of them put together. It's that putting it together piece. See, it got a lot more complicated. So we can see that there's different options. It's like a color spectrum. So we have our A, B, C, D, and F, and E again. But now we have subdivisions. We have one that's now a capital A, lowercase f. Well, what does that mean? That means it's a tropical area that is fully humid. We have an area that's, as an example, CFA. That means it's a temperate, fully humid, and it's also going to have a hot summer. So there's a pattern in which we follow. So question 12 says, refer to figure 9.11. List 3 observations that you now make based on the spatial patterns presented in this map. Now this map is more fine-tuned. These observations can be something that is unexpected or surprising. So let's break each climate group. Let's talk about that and all the options within. So as we can see for climate A, which are considered tropical climates, a second letter is added. Why? Well, it's important to know that monsoons are the seasonal reversal of winds that bring tremendous amounts of precipitation to much of the South and Southeast Asia. Also note that the savanna is a grassland found in tropics and subtropic areas. So we can see that if it's an AF, it indicates that it's year-round precipitation. This is a tropical rainforest. Or an AM indicates monsoonal precipitation, meaning that it's seasonal. So you're able to work through these different options and see what it says. Here's an option for AW and AS. So question 13, 14, and 15 is having you look at, not just the figure above, that big map that puts it all together, but also the very fine-tuned definition of each one of these and answer questions like, describe the spatial distribution using what you've learned. Why do you think Southeast Asian islands have tropical rainforest climates, but the continental parts may either be monsoonal or savanna? And then there's a great question that kind of brings it back and talks about the Lion King and thinking about, the climate and Lion King and where it was set and how does that work. Moving forward, we can look at B-type climates. We've got, again, a handful, BWH. BWK, so on and so forth. So what it says here is for dry climates, second and third letters are added. If a W is a second letter, then that represents a desert location. If an S is a second letter, then that represents a mid-latitude grassland. So again, we have these codes that we kind of work in. Questions 16, 17, and 18, 16 and 17 are the same thing, asking you to reflect on those definitions, looking again at that map. Same thing for climate C. I live in Santa Clarita, so this is our dominant climate. Here is a C. We're actually a CSA. We are considered a hot summer Mediterranean climate, which makes sense because here in Santa Clarita, we get like 2 days a year that are really cold in January. Otherwise, you can pretty much grow vegetables and produce all year round here in Santa Clarita. We do have not crazy humidity; it's more Mediterranean. We're comparable to Greece, which is pretty interesting that we're in California that we have that. So again, correlate those locations, drag them up to the map, and be able to answer those questions about what you feel or think about in those observations and interpretations. D climates are continental climates. Second and third letters are added again. It utilizes the same idea, but this time we're looking at places. When I think of D climates, I think of places that genuinely you get seasons. Like in most of California, we go from one season to the next. It's like 2 days. It's over. Other places, they have like weeks of fall and months of winter, and they get all the kinds of these steps that kind of work their way through. So they go from nice having summers and having very frigid, freezing winters with snow in their front yards and snow plows, things that I've never had to deal with here in California. That's what I kind of think of, areas like that. And then last is going to be E, which are polar climates. Some groups also use F for highlands and stuff like that, but this group isn't using it. So we're really simplifying just these main ones, A through E. Again, describe what you think. What's interesting again about E climates is that it is polar climates. We know that polar climates can be very similar to desert climates because it has a very minimum amount of precipitation, but this time they're taking temperature into consideration. So a simplified guide to climate classification. Again, this is where I mentioned that build your own adventure. Scott did a fantastic job with this. So we're able to kind of work our way through it. And by doing so, you kind of work through your patterns. So is this yes, no, and you work your way through. So, thinking just simplistically, using your home as an example when walking through this. Is your warmest month less than 10 degrees Celsius? If the answer is yes, you go over here and you get to choose one of these two options. If your answer is no, you drop down to the next letter and you keep doing that. So as an example, like I said, we're Santa Clarita. I'm at a Mediterranean hot summer. So I would have worked my way through this table and gotten there. The other thing, just like any dichotomous key, if you find that just things are starting to look kind of funky, start over again. It's much easier. Now, I was just talking about just applying your personal experiences, but you can actually use something a little bit more specific. What could that be? Your climate graph. Your climate graph provides generalized data, long-term study data, and averages. So you're able to see that. You're also able to look at your climate graph and go, well, on average, the warmest month is June, and it's going to be at whatever degrees Celsius, and so on and so forth. So you're able to use a climate graph and this table to categorize a code. Why is that important? Well, it's so important when you're doing research articles and stuff like that, because imagine that someone says, hey, I'm a pen pal from Europe. I'm going to come stay with you for a month. Great. That's exciting. First time to America. This is great. They go, what should I pack for? You could literally give them a 2 or 3 letter code, and they would know exactly what your climate is. We don't do that, of course. We like to drag things out and talk about, the complications of stuff, but that would be the easiest way to do it. So moving forward, next you're going to use a simplified guide to climate classification, that table before, and the data below in order to essentially give it a category lettering. So it says, use figure 9.12 above and the data below and find out what the climate classification is for example location 1. You'll do the same thing for location 2, location 3, location 4, and then that'll bring us into this next piece, So So then we can look at, oh, I guess I should back up. So then that would wrap you up. So you're able to use these data to create your climate classification. Now, I mentioned earlier, California's climate type is really diverse, as we know. When people say, oh, I'm going to come visit you in California, it's like, oh, what part of California? Because, you could technically go surfing and snowboarding in the same day. So, it depends on that region. And we find that not only does it have to do with our latitude, but it has to do with our elevation. It has to do with our wind patterns. It has to do with, again, those 5 elements. Which ones does it mostly rely on in your location? So it says here 4 of the 5 major Köppen climate classifications are present in California, as seen below. In parts of the Great Basin Desert, Mojave, the Colorado, we'll find that there's tremendous amounts of B or arid climates. We'll find Mediterranean climates. We'll find areas of cold continental and also climates of higher elevation are also observed in this map. Like I said, we can go surfing and snowboarding in the same day. So why is this so important for us? Why is California so unique and diverse that we have 4 of the 5 major Köppen climate classifications here? It's because of I genuinely believe it's because of our latitude and topography and the fact that we are long. Most states are wide. We're long. We transcend all that, so we get to see these different categories in place. So now we're able to observe a map of California showing its topography and geomorphic provinces. So we're going to answer some questions that compare both this diagram as well with this diagram. Do we see any patterns, any observations? So as an example, question 28 says, compare California's climate map to the California topography or topographic map that shows the elevations. What are the peak elevations where an ET climate would be found? So you're going to be able to then pull some of those attributes back and forth between these diagrams. Question B, using your critical thinking skills, what are the implications for the irrigation needs of the San Joaquin Valley? So talk a little bit about that. Again, using both the topography map that shows the geomorphic provinces compared to the general climate map, because we know that the San Joaquin Valley is one of the major contributors for agriculture for not just the state but for the United States. So what type of challenges do they have? They have all this agriculture because their soil is so rich, but do they have all the access to the water? And those are some of the observations and interpretations you're going to make. Now, shifting climate patterns is a big thing, right? As you've learned early in the lab, at least 30 years of precipitation and temperature data are used to classify a location's climate. As climate changes across the globe, it makes sense that the maps, like the ones shown in figure 3.11 and 3.13 above, will need to be updated. Scientists actively research how climate classification patterns have changed over time and predict, based on those general trends, what it will be like in the future. So what we're going to do is a little bit of an activity. So it says here, step 1, you're going to look at the Köppen-Geiger Observation and Predicted Climate Shift website. So you're either going to take a picture of that QR code or click the hyperlink, and you're going to follow these steps. Step 2, click on the legend icon. Step 3, scroll downwards so that you're familiar with how the different colors and how to use this activity. So as you kind of work through that, you'll get a couple questions. 31 says in 2 or 3 sentences, describe how the climate pattern is predicted to change in North America between the year 2000 and 2100. And then question 32, globally, which climate pattern seems to be the most change from 2000 to 2100? And that being said, we wrap up part B. So part C is the final part of this lab. It's the synthesis, your local climate. So what does a climate graph look like in your location? So what you're going to do is you're going to be creating your own climate graph. But in order to do that, we have to collect data. So the lab itself identifies for you to do your town, your city. Obviously it depends on what your instructor has assigned, if they've picked somewhere in particular. But for the most part, we're looking at just, can you create a climate graph for your location or your home? So the first part says, question 33, search the internet to find the average monthly precipitation and temperature data for your location. Once you do so, be sure to plug it into the table on the next page down here. Now, the key to success is that chances are it's going to be in Fahrenheit and also going to be in inches. You need to convert it into Celsius and into centimeters. So make sure you do that on that table. So then it says your instructor may direct you to an online resource that will provide this information, or you may follow the steps below. So what ends up happening is if you can find it elsewhere, or your instructor tells you to find it elsewhere, great. If it's not available, then this is where you can actually access it. You can get it from the Weather Channel directly. So it teaches you to do that. The caveat would be is that it's not going to give you averages. So you'll have to solve the average, which is super easy. The average is going to be the high plus the low and divide it by 2. But some places have data readily available, some places don't. The other thing to take in consideration, which I believe is actually on the next page, let me see. Yep, using your critical thinking skills, is that unfortunately the weather data does not always use 30-year data. Sometimes it can be 10 or 20 or something else. It depends on how long they've been collecting data, if there's been a weather station there that long. So it's asking you, what challenges or what fallacies or what problems might you come with if maybe your data is only a 2-year data? Is that going to really provide you a generalized amount of information to understand the average climate or to see if there's been change? Question 35 says following the example shown in figure 9.3, now you get to graph your own location's precipitation. So you use that data from that table above, and you're going to plot in a bar graph, the bars, your precipitation values, and then you're going to be utilizing your line to draw your temperature values that are on average for each month. And the directions are certainly there to follow through. Now, after you do that, now we've got some references. So, question 36, refer to California's climate map, figure 9.13. What is the climate in your location based on that map? Now, using your location's data from table 9.7 and the simplified guide to climate classification, now you're going to solve your own and see if it's the same. Are the answers the same? Are they different? Why do you think it might be different? Why might they be the same? Question 39 says, refer to the figure. What geomorphic province is your location in? And then question 40, list the major climate controls in your area. And then it gives you some helpful tips in order to do that. And then question 41 says, now let's apply what we've learned. Considering how climate patterns are shifting globally, do you anticipate that the climate pattern at your location will change by 2100? Explain why or why not in a couple sentences. Which brings us to the last page, which is a bigger version of the climate classification map between 1901 and 2010. So that's part of your appendix of this lab. So again, this was really set aside to teach you the steps in how to understand climate. When we talk about climate, we're not talking about day-to-day weather. We're talking about day-to-day weather and reflection of long-term data. You also learn how to use the big word, the Köppen climate classification system, and how to research data on your own and to create your own climate graph and then to plot it and solve your own climate classification system for your region. I hope this video was helpful. Be sure if you have any questions, comments, be sure to mention them below. Even mention what your local climate classification is so we can see how many people from around the state of California are going to be using this to see if there's any differences or correlations. Be sure to like, subscribe, and I will see you on the next video.